July 1998. Inside a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., the richest man in the world is being deposed on videotape, and he is not handling it well. Bill Gates, the man who built Microsoft into the most dominant technology company on the planet, sits across from government lawyers in the largest antitrust case the United States had brought against a corporation in a generation. And instead of the calm, articulate visionary the public had come to associate with him, the tape shows something else entirely. A defensive, evasive, occasionally smirking witness who repeatedly claims not to remember emails he personally wrote, who quibbles over the definition of basic words like compete and concerned, and who, when the tape is later played in an open court, makes the presiding judge visibly skeptical of his credibility. The footage becomes a national sensation, replayed endlessly on television. The same man Time magazine would later put on its cover as a visionary. Reshaping the modern world is, in this moment, looking like exactly what federal prosecutors are arguing he is. A ruthless monopolist who used Microsoft's market dominance to illegally crush competitors, and who, when finally asked to explain his conduct under oath, simply refuses to give a straight answer. Here's the part that makes Bill Gates' story far more complicated than the popular image of tech genius turned generous philanthropists suggest. The same competitive intensity, same all-consuming need to win that built Microsoft into a company worth hundreds of billions of dollars was also found by a federal court to have violated the country's antitrust laws. And decades later, that same man's personal conduct, his relationships, his judgment about who he chose to associate with, including a convicted sex offender he continued meeting with for years after the man's conviction was public knowledge, would become the subject of a different kind of reckoning. Entirely one that complicated, permanently, the carefully built image of the world's most famous philanthropist. How does a socially awkward kid, obsessed with computer code, become not just the richest man alive, but a globally recognized symbol of disease eradication and humanitarian generosity, while also being a man whose business practices were ruled illegal by a federal court, and whose personal judgment, even by his own later admission, was seriously flawed in ways that unraveled his marriage and his reputation simultaneously? This is the story of Bill Gates, not simply the philanthropist, and not simply the monopolist, but the singular, demanding, deeply complicated man underneath both reputations. Welcome to Blurr. Today we begin an extraordinary journey into the life of one of the most influential figures of the modern age, Bill Gates. From a curious young boy fascinated by computers to the co-founder of Microsoft and one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs, his story is a remarkable tale of ambition, innovation, risk-taking, and vision. In this first part of our audiobook biography, we'll explore Bill Gates' childhood, his early passion for technology, his formative years at school, and the events that laid the foundation for a technological revolution that would change the world forever. Sit back, relax, and enjoy part 1 of the Bill Gates biography, here on Blurr. Every consequential life deserves one real question beneath the surface facts. The thing that, once understood, makes the whole story click into place. For Bill Gates, the easy question is, how did he build the world's biggest software company? That's a matter of historical record. Interesting part. The harder, more honest question is this. How does the same relentless, take-no-prisoners competitive drive that made Bill Gates one of the most feared and successful businessmen of the 20th century, a man whose company was found by a federal court to have engaged in illegal anti-competitive conduct, become, within the span of roughly a decade, the same instinct redirected toward eradicating malaria and polio across the developing world, donating tens of billions of dollars with a level of strategic rigor that transformed how the entire field of global philanthropy operates? Is total, singular focus on winning, regardless of the domain, simply a personality trait that doesn't actually change when you redirect it from market share to disease eradication? And if that's true, what does it explain about both the genuine good his foundation has done and the serious lapses in personal judgment that have damaged his reputation more in recent years than any antitrust ruling ever did? This is the question this biography is built around. Was Bill Gates' transformation from ruthless monopolist to global humanitarian a genuine change of heart? or simply the same unyielding competitive instinct pointed at a more flattering target? And can a person's capacity for enormous, measurable good and serious, documented personal and professional misconduct really coexist this completely inside one single, unresolved life? Chapter 1. Origins. A comfortable, competitive household, William Henry Gates III was born on October 28, 1955, in Seattle, Washington, into a family that was, by any reasonable measure, comfortable and well-connected, though not extraordinarily wealthy by the standards he would later set himself. His father, William Henry Gates Sr., was a respected attorney, and his mother, Mary Maxwell Gates, was deeply involved in civic and charitable organizations, including serving on the board of First Interstate Bank and as a national board member for United Way, a detail that, in hindsight, foreshadows the eventual scale and seriousness of her son's own philanthropic ambitions decades later. The family also had deep roots in Seattle's civic and business establishment, with Gates's maternal grandfather having served as a bank president, giving young Bill an early, formative exposure to a world of institutional leadership and civic responsibility well before he had any concrete sense of what he himself might eventually accomplish. The household Gates grew up in was intensely competitive, not merely tolerant of competition, but actively built around it. Family members have described an environment where games, sports, and intellectual debates at the dinner table were treated with real seriousness, where winning mattered, and where young Bill, even as a child, displayed an intensity and single-mindedness about competition that stood out even within an already competitive family. The family famously organized intensely competitive sporting events and games during summer vacations at a lakeside retreat, complete with structured tournaments and even informally kept score-keeping across generations, reinforcing from a very young age that effort, strategy, and winning were activities worth taking with total seriousness rather than treating as casual leisure. This wasn't gentle, encouraging competitiveness. It was the kind that produced real friction, including, by Gates's own later acknowledgement, a genuinely difficult adolescent relationship with his mother, who he has described clashing with seriously enough during his teenage years that his parents eventually sent him to a counselor specifically to help manage the conflict, with Gates later recalling that the counselor's most lasting advice was essentially to recognize that he was, in fact, in a kind of ongoing battle of wills with his mother, that neither side was going to definitively win, and that he needed to find a way to coexist with that tension, rather than expecting it to simply resolve. An early total obsession with computers in 1968 at Lakeside School, an elite private school in Seattle. The school's Mothers Club used proceeds from a rummage sale to purchase computer time on a mainframe terminal, a remarkable, and at the time, genuinely unusual investment for a school to make, since access to computers in 1968 was rare, even at major universities, let alone secondary schools. Gates, then 13, became almost instantly and totally consumed by the opportunity, spending every available hour at the terminal, teaching himself programming through direct experimentation and through a small, equally obsessed group of similarly gifted classmates, including Paul Allen, 2 years his senior, who would become his most important early collaborator and eventual Microsoft co-founder. This early access to computing resources that almost no other teenagers in the country had available to them gave Gates and his small circle of friends an enormous, almost accidental head start. He has described this period of his life with genuine, undiminished enthusiasm decades later, recalling marathon overnight programming sessions at the terminal, an addictive thrill in solving genuinely difficult logical puzzles, and a sense, even as a young teenager, that he had stumbled into something most adults around him didn't yet understand the significance of. At one point, the small group of Lakeside students became skilled enough and used enough computing time that the company providing the terminal access actually banned them temporarily for exploiting bugs in the system's software to gain free additional computing time. An early, telling example of Gates's instinct to probe any system he encountered for exploitable advantages, channeled here into something closer to mischief than then. The far higher stakes business decisions the same instinct would later produce, a profitable hustle. Even as a teenager, Gates's competitive, business-minded instincts emerged early and combined directly with his technical obsession. While still a teenager, he and Paul Allen formed a small company called Trafodata, building a computer system designed to analyze traffic flow data for local municipalities, a venture that, while not hugely commercially successful, gave Gates direct, practical early experience, translating a technical skill into an actual paying business. Years before Microsoft existed in any form, he also worked, alongside Allen and other classmates, on a project to computerize Lakeside's class scheduling system, reportedly manipulating the program at one point to ensure he was placed in classes with a favorable ratio of female to male students, an early, telling example of the same instinct to find and exploit whatever advantage was available within any system he encountered, a trait that would recur in far higher stakes forms throughout the rest of his career. Harvard, and a growing restlessness. In 1973, Gates enrolled at Harvard University, nominally to study, though he has since described spending considerably more time playing poker and working on programming projects than attending the lectures he was actually paying tuition for. He maintained contact with Paul Allen throughout this period, and the two continued discussing the rapidly emerging personal computer industry, watching closely as companies began releasing the first commercially available microcomputers, machines that, crucially, had no real operating software written specifically for them, representing an enormous, largely unclaimed market opportunity that both young men recognized well before most of the existing computing industry took the personal computer revolution seriously, the moment that changed everything. 1975. Paul Allen showed Gates a magazine cover featuring the Altair 8800, one of the first commercially available microcomputers, sold as a kit to hobbyists. The two recognized immediately that the machine, while a genuine technical achievement, had no software to actually make it useful for anything beyond hobbyist tinkering. They contacted the Altair's manufacturer, MITS, claiming, somewhat ahead of the actual facts, that they had already developed a basic program language interpreter that could run on the machine. They had not yet actually written it. What followed was an intense, high-stakes scramble, working from Harvard's computer lab without ever having actually touched an Altair machine themselves. Gates and Allen wrote and debugged a working version of BASIC for the Altair within roughly 8 weeks, a remarkable feat of focused, high-pressure technical work. When Allen flew to Albuquerque to demonstrate the software for MITS, it worked essentially on the first real attempt, a success that secured a licensing deal with MITS and gave Gates and Allen their first real commercial foothold in what would become the personal computer software industry. Gates, recognizing the scale of the opportunity opening up in front of him, dropped out of Harvard to pursue it full-time, founding Microsoft, initially styled Microsoft, in 1975. Chapter 2. Early Struggles. A tiny company in a tiny, unproven market. Microsoft's earliest years were defined by genuine financial precarity and a market that, while promising in theory, was still tiny and largely unproven in practice. Personal computers were owned by a small population of hobbyists. The available hardware was primitive and unreliable, and the entire concept of software as something companies would pay meaningful licensing fees for, rather than something that simply came bundled for free with hardware, was not yet an established industry norm. Microsoft in these early years operated with a tiny staff, modest revenue, and a level of financial uncertainty that required Gates to personally manage cash flow and contracts with an intensity that left little room for anything beyond survival and growth. An open letter to hobbyists and an early war over piracy in 1976. Frustrated by the widespread, casual copying and unauthorized distribution of Microsoft's basic software among the hobbyist computing community, a practice the era's hobbyist culture largely treated as normal and even community-spirited, Gates published a sharply worded open letter directly criticizing the practice, arguing that unauthorized copying was directly undermining the ability of small software companies like his own to survive and continue producing quality products. He pointed out, with characteristic bluntness, that despite the software's wide informal distribution among hobbyists, Microsoft had received royalty payments, covering only a small fraction of the total number of people he estimated were actually using the program, framing the imbalance as something close to outright theft from the small team of programmers who had built the software in the first place. The letter generated significant controversy within the hobbyist community, many of whom viewed Gates's stance as a betrayal of the collaborative, open-sharing ethos that had characterized early computing culture, with some hobbyist publications printing irritated rebuttals, arguing that Gates simply didn't understand or respect the cooperative spirit that had made the broader hobbyist computing movement possible in the first place. This early public confrontation reveals something important about Gates from nearly the very beginning of his career, an unusually clear-eyed, unsentimental understanding that software needed to be treated as a serious, protectable commercial product, a position that put him at odds with much of his own original community, but one he held to with total conviction, regardless of how unpopular it made him within that community, and one that would, within a matter of years, become the standard, unquestioned norm across the entire software industry, rather than the contested minority position it represented at the time he first articulated it, losing Paul Allen's equal partnership, while keeping him close. As Microsoft grew through the late 1970s, tension developed within the founding partnership over equity division, with Gates pushing for and eventually securing a significantly larger ownership share than the initial 50-50 split the two friends had informally agreed to at the company's founding, arguing that his greater contribution to the business side of the company justified the adjustment, eventually settling on a split that gave Gates roughly 60% ownership against Allen's 40%. This negotiation, conducted between two close friends who had built the company together from nothing, set an early pattern that would recur throughout Gates's career, a clear, almost clinical willingness to renegotiate relationships and agreements in his own favor when he believed the underlying contribution justified it, regardless of the emotional or relational cost involved. The friendship between Gates and Allen survived this period, though it would face far more serious strain years later, after Allen's Hodgkin's lymphoma diagnosis in 1982, when he discovered Gates and another Microsoft executive discussing diluting his ownership stake while he was undergoing treatment and largely absent from daily company operations, a conversation Allen overheard directly through a partially open office door, and that he has described in his own memoir published decades later as a genuine betrayal that permanently altered his view of his old friend and business partner, prompting Allen to step back from full-time involvement with it while Microsoft not long afterward, maintaining his ownership stake and board position for years, but never again occupying the same close, central role in the company's daily operations that had defined the earliest years of their partnership. 3. First success. The IBM deal that built an empire. In 1980, IBM, then the single most dominant and respected name in computing, approached Microsoft to provide an operating system for IBM's upcoming personal computer, a machine IBM expected would be a modest, secondary product line rather than the industry-transforming device it eventually became. Microsoft did not actually have a suitable operating system ready, in a move that would define the entire rest of Gates's career. Allen quickly acquired the rights to an existing operating system, SHIDOS, sometimes described informally as Quick and Dirty Operating System, from a small Seattle company called Seattle Computer Products, paying a relatively modest sum for the rights without initially disclosing to the seller the full scale and significance of the IBM deal the software was actually intended for, a detail that, when it later became public, generated its own separate controversy over whether Microsoft had negotiated in good faith with a much smaller, less informed counterparty. Microsoft adapted the acquired software and licensed the resulting product, eventually known as MS-DOS, to IBM. The structure of this deal was the single most consequential business decision of Gates's career. Rather than selling IBM exclusive rights to the operating system outright, Gates negotiated to retain Microsoft's ownership of MS-DOS, licensing it to IBM non-exclusively, which meant Microsoft remained free to license the same operating system to any other computer manufacturer that wanted to build IBM-compatible machines. IBM, by most accounts, significantly underestimated how valuable this concession would eventually prove to be, viewing the operating system itself as a relatively minor, replaceable component of the overall personal computer business compared to the hardware itself, an assessment that would prove to be one of the most consequential strategic miscalculations in the history of the technology industry. As the IBM PC became the dominant industry standard, and an entire ecosystem of compatible clone manufacturers emerged to compete with IBM directly, every single one of them needed an operating system. And Microsoft, thanks to that single contractual structure, was selling it to all of them. This decision, more than any single piece of code Gates ever personally wrote, is the foundational reason Microsoft became one of the most valuable companies in history. Windows and the birth of total market dominance. Throughout the 1980s, Microsoft expanded its position by developing Windows, a graphical operating environment that, in its early versions, was widely criticized as a clumsy, derivative imitation of the graphical interface pioneered by Apple's Macintosh. Criticism that included a lawsuit from Apple alleging Microsoft had copied protected visual elements of the Macintosh interface, a suit Microsoft ultimately won in part because Apple itself had licensed certain interface elements to Microsoft years earlier, under a separate agreement that complicated Apple's later claims of unauthorized copying. Despite the early technical criticism, Windows' steadily technical criticism improved across successive versions, and crucially, because Microsoft controlled the operating system running on the vast majority of personal computers sold worldwide, Windows became, by the early 1990s, the default computing environment for hundreds of millions of users almost by simple market gravity, regardless of whether each individual version was considered technically superior to its competitors at any given moment. By the time Microsoft went public in 1986, Gates, still in, his early 30s, had become one of the youngest billionaires in American history, and Microsoft had positioned itself, through the combination of the IBM deal's licensing structure and Windows' subsequent ubiquity, as the single most powerful gatekeeper controlling how the vast majority of the world's computer users would interact with their machines for decades to come. This period also established the management style for which Gates became legendary within the technology industry. Famously demanding, prone to harshly worded internal memos criticizing engineering decisions he considered weak or poorly reasoned, and known for asking pointed, occasionally humiliating technical questions in meetings specifically designed to expose whether an employee genuinely understood the material they were presenting or were simply offering a superficial summary, a management approach that produced both intense employee loyalty among those who thrived under the pressure and significant attrition among those who found the environment genuinely hostile. Chapter 4. Major Failure. The browser war and the conduct that triggered a federal case. By the mid-1990s, as the Internet became commercially significant, a new, competitive battlefield emerged around web browsers, software that let ordinary users actually access the Internet. Netscape Navigator, made by an independent company, was the dominant browser at the time. Microsoft began aggressively pushing its own competing product, Internet Explorer, rather than competing purely on the merits of the product. Microsoft, according to extensive evidence later presented in federal court, used its dominant control over the Windows operating system to disadvantage Netscape directly, bundling Internet Explorer for free with every copy of Windows, making it difficult or impossible for computer manufacturers to remove it or feature competing browsers prominently, and in some cases, entering into agreements with manufacturers and Internet service providers specifically designed to limit Netscape's distribution and visibility. United States v. Microsoft. In May 1998, the United States Department of Justice, joined by a coalition of state attorneys general, filed a major antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft, alleging that the company had engaged in illegal, anti-competitive conduct specifically designed to maintain its operating system monopoly and to illegally extend that monopoly into the browser market. The case became one of the most closely watched and significant corporate antitrust proceedings in American history, drawing direct comparisons to the historic antitrust breakups of Standard Oil and AT&T decades earlier. Gates's videotaped deposition, conducted as part of the case, became a defining, deeply unflattering public moment. As detailed at the start of this biography, hours of recorded testimony in which Gates appeared evasive, combative, and Repeatedly unable or unwilling to provide direct answers to straightforward questions about emails and internal communications that government lawyers had already obtained as evidence, the presiding judge, Thomas Penfield Jackson, was reportedly so unimpressed by Gates's demeanor and credibility on the tape that it visibly shaped the court's broader skepticism toward Microsoft's overall defense. The ruling in April 2000, Judge Jackson ruled that Microsoft had indeed violated federal antitrust law, finding that the company had used illegal, anti-competitive tactics to protect its operating system monopoly and to attempt to monopolize the browser market as well. The initial ruling called for the dramatic remedy of breaking Microsoft into two separate companies, one for the operating system business and one for the rest of Microsoft's software products, a remedy that, had it survived the appeals process intact, would have fundamentally and permanently altered the structure of the entire technology industry. On appeal, the breakup remedy was overturned, though the appellate court upheld the core finding that Microsoft had violated antitrust law. The case was eventually settled in 2001 under terms that required Microsoft to share certain technical information with competitors and submit to ongoing government oversight of its conduct, but stopped well short of the company breakup originally ordered. Possible consequence, but the case left a permanent mark on the company's public reputation and on Gates's own personal image, transforming him in a meaningful segment of public perception from the era's defining technology visionary into the symbol of an aggressive, occasionally illegal corporate monopolist, a reputation that would take years and a deliberate, significant personal reinvention to meaningfully shift. Chapter 5. The Turning Point. Stepping back from Microsoft, in January 2000, in the midst of the ongoing antitrust proceedings, Gates stepped down as Microsoft's chief executive officer, transitioning to the role of chief software architect while handing day-to-day operational leadership to Steve Ballmer, a longtime Microsoft executive and close associate. While officially framed around wanting to focus more directly on product strategy and technical direction, the timing, occurring during the most legally and reputationally damaging period in the company's history, has been widely interpreted as at least partially connected to the broader pressure the antitrust case and its accompanying public relations crisis had placed on Gates personally, regardless of how the transition was officially characterized at the time. Marriage and a foundation take shape. In 1994, Gates married Melinda French, a Microsoft employee he had met at the company years earlier, and the couple's relationship became, over the following years, the direct catalyst for the most significant redirection of his life's focus. Melinda has described pushing Gates, sometimes directly against his own initial instincts, to engage more seriously and personally with questions of global health and poverty, including during a formative trip the couple took together to Africa that exposed Gates directly to the scale of preventable disease and child mortality affecting the developing world, a reality his enormous wealth and technical mindset, he has since acknowledged, had simply never required him to confront directly before. In 2000, Gates and Melinda formally combined several smaller charitable efforts into the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, endowing it with billions of dollars of others Microsoft stock and establishing from the outset an unusually rigorous, almost engineering-style approach to philanthropy, demanding measurable outcomes, rigorous cost-effectiveness analysis, and a willingness to fund unglamorous, difficult global health interventions like vaccine distribution infrastructure and disease eradication campaigns that receive far less public attention than more visible philanthropic causes, but that Gates and his team had calculated would save the largest number of lives per dollar spent, a genuine pivot, powered by the same underlying instinct. What makes this turning point so revealing, in hindsight, is not that Gates suddenly became a different person with a softer, more generous temperament. Colleagues and observers from this transition period have consistently described the same demanding, data-driven, relentlessly competitive intensity that had defined his decades at Microsoft, now redirected toward an entirely different scoreboard. Rather than market share and revenue, the new metrics were lives saved, diseases eradicated, and vaccination rates improved. He approached global health with the same blunt, often confrontational insistence on rigorous data and measurable results that had defined his business career, frequently challenging established public health organizations and traditional charitable approaches that he felt lacked sufficient accountability or evidence-based rigor, bringing both the considerable benefits and the real interpersonal friction of his Microsoft-era management style directly into the world of global philanthropy. Thank you for listening to part 1 of the Bill Gates biography on Blurr. We've explored the early years of Bill Gates' life, the experiences that shaped his thinking, and the beginnings of a journey that would eventually transform personal computing in the modern world. But the story is far from over. In part 2, we'll follow Bill Gates as Microsoft grows into a global powerhouse, examine the challenges and the controversies he faced, and discover how he transitioned from tech billionaire to one of the world's leading philanthropists. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please support the channel by liking this video, subscribing to Blurr, and hitting the prior notification bell so you never miss future biographies and audiobooks. Most importantly, leave a comment below and let us know. What do you think was the most important decision Bill Gates made in his early life? We'll see you in part 2.